It was a bright and busy morning at the airport. People rushed around with their luggage, families hugged and said goodbyes, and the hum of announcements filled the air. Among all the travelers was a young black girl who walked with quiet confidence, her suitcase rolling steadily behind her. She was dressed neatly with a simple but stylish outfit and a calm smile on her face. She had a sense of purpose as she moved through the crowd. Today, she was flying first class for the first time, and she had been looking forward to it for weeks. Her excitement was not about luxury or comfort. She had traveled before, but this trip was special. It was a chance to experience something new, to be treated with a little more attention and care during the flight. She held her ticket tightly in her hand, glancing at it to reassure herself that everything was in order. The boarding gate was busy, and she could see the flight attendant directing passengers, calling out rows, and checking boarding passes with a smile. When it was her turn, she stepped forward, her posture straight and calm. She handed over her ticket politely. At first, the flight attendant smiled and scanned the boarding pass. But as she looked up, her smile faltered slightly. Something about the young girl seemed to surprise her. She frowned, glanced at the screen, and then back at the girl. "Excuse me," the attendant said slowly, her tone polite but cautious. "Are you sure this is your seat?" The girl nodded, trying to keep her calm. "Yes, ma'am. I am in first class today." She smiled politely, hoping to ease any tension. The attendant looked again at the boarding pass and then at the girl. She hesitated as if she could not believe what she was seeing. She cleared her throat. "First class? Are you traveling alone?" "Yes, I am," the girl replied, keeping her voice steady. She had expected a little surprise or maybe curiosity, but she did not expect judgment or doubt. The flight attendant shifted uncomfortably. She glanced around as if seeking confirmation from someone else, but there was no one to back her up. The girl could feel the hesitation in the air, the subtle way the attendant's eyes lingered on her. She had been treated politely at the gate earlier, but now something had changed. The atmosphere seemed heavier, charged with a quiet tension. The girl took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay composed. She had been taught to handle situations like this with patience and dignity. She smiled again, though it was a little forced. "I have my ticket right here," she said, holding it out for the attendant to see once more. The attendant scanned it again, slowly this time. She frowned and shook her head. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice slightly louder now. "This seat, I'm not sure you should be here. This is first class. Are you sure you are allowed?" The girl's heart sank a little, but she did not show it. Instead, she spoke calmly. "Yes, I am allowed. This is my ticket, and I have paid for this seat." Her words were clear, respectful, and firm. She could see other passengers glancing their way, curious about the exchange. Some seemed confused, others whispered quietly to their companions. The attendant sighed and looked around again. She muttered something under her breath, then returned her gaze to the girl. I need to be sure. First class is very exclusive. Are you certain this is not an error?" "Yes, it is not an error," the girl replied, her voice steady. She felt a little frustrated now, but she refused to let it show. She knew that losing her temper would not help. She needed to stay calm and polite, even if the situation was uncomfortable. The flight attendant hesitated, then waved vaguely toward the cabin. "Well, you can go ahead, I suppose," she said, though her tone suggested doubt. The girl thanked her politely and began walking toward the first-class section. She rolled her suitcase along the polished floor, trying to ignore the subtle glances from the flight attendant and a few other passengers who were watching with curiosity. As she approached her seat, she noticed a few things that made her feel uneasy. The flight attendant's demeanor had changed. There was a stiffness in her movements, a way she avoided making direct eye contact. It was clear that the attendant was uncomfortable and perhaps even a little judgmental. The girl could sense it, but she held her head high. She reminded herself that she had a right to be there, just like anyone else. Once she reached her seat, she set her suitcase in the storage compartment above and sat down. The seat was wide and comfortable, with soft leather and a small pillow. She tried to focus on the excitement of flying first class, on the little luxuries she had heard about, like extra legroom and a personal screen. But the tension from the boarding process lingered in her mind. She noticed a few passengers nearby watching her. Some looked curious, others sympathetic, and a few seemed surprised that she was in first class. She realized that not everyone would understand why she was there. Some might make assumptions based on her age, appearance, or race. She took a deep breath and reminded herself that their opinions did not matter. She was confident in her place, in her right to be there, and in the choices her family had made to provide her with opportunities. As the plane began to fill, the flight attendant returned to her duties, checking passengers and preparing for takeoff. She kept glancing at the girl, and each time their eyes met, there was a brief flash of tension. The girl did not look away. She remained composed, quietly confident, knowing that she had handled the situation with grace. The flight attendant's supervisor walked by and gave a quick nod to the staff, but the tension between the young girl and the flight attendant did not go unnoticed. Other passengers whispered softly among themselves. Some exchanged surprised looks as if they could sense that something unusual had just happened. The girl ignored it. She focused on the window seat beside her, watching planes taxi along the runway and the hustle of the airport below. She remembered the lessons her father had taught her. Always remain calm in difficult situations. Speak clearly and politely, and never let others' ignorance shake your confidence. She thought about her father's advice on how to navigate a world that could be unfair or judgmental at times. He had always told her that her worth was not determined by others' opinions, but by her own integrity and strength. As she settled into her seat, she could feel her excitement growing again. The cabin smelled of fresh leather and clean air. The hum of activity around her reminded her that soon they would be in the air, soaring above the clouds. She imagined the view from the window, the small towns and cities shrinking beneath her, the endless sky stretching out in front. Even with the earlier tension, she felt a sense of calm and anticipation. She had faced a challenge with dignity, and she had not let it shake her confidence. She reminded herself that this flight was just one small moment, and that the world was full of opportunities for those who were patient, strong, and true to themselves. As the flight attendants made their final checks and the plane prepared for takeoff, the young girl adjusted her seatbelt and looked out the window one more time. She was ready for the journey ahead, both in the air and in life. Whatever challenges might come her way, she knew she could face them with grace and courage. And as the engines roared to life and the plane began to taxi toward the runway, she felt a quiet thrill. This was more than a flight. It was a lesson in confidence, dignity, and resilience, a lesson she would carry with her long after she had landed. The hum of the engines grew louder. The plane began to move faster. The ground blurred beneath her, and then, with a smooth lift, the plane rose into the sky. The young girl held onto the armrests lightly, feeling the gentle sway as they ascended. She looked out at the horizon, the clouds beginning to stretch endlessly in front of her, and a small smile touched her lips. She had made it through a challenging moment with grace, and now, for a brief while, the world below seemed quiet and distant. This flight, this moment, was hers, and she knew that wherever life took her next, she could handle it with patience, poise, and confidence. The young girl tried to settle in after takeoff, but the air in the cabin felt heavier than it should. She had expected the flight to be smooth and calm, filled with the excitement of flying high above the clouds, but something kept nagging at her. The flight attendant, who had hesitated at the gate, was now moving through the first-class cabin with a careful, almost scrutinizing glance every time she passed by. It was as if she could not believe that the girl truly belonged there. At first, the girl tried to ignore it. She focused on the small comforts of her seat, the soft pillow, the blanket neatly folded beside her, the little screen in front that promised movies and music. She had been looking forward to this moment, imagining herself relaxed and at ease, enjoying the flight. But the subtle tension made it hard to relax. Every time the attendant glanced at her, the girl felt her presence like a weight pressing down on the moment. It was not just the flight attendant. Some passengers were now whispering quietly to one another, throwing curious or suspicious looks. The girl tried to focus on the window, imagining the clouds and the vast sky beyond, but she could feel the discomfort building around her, an invisible pressure she had never experienced before in her travels. She kept her calm, reminding herself that she had every right to be there and that she had nothing to prove to anyone. A few minutes later, the flight attendant returned to the girl's row. This time her tone was sharper, though still polite. "Excuse me," she said, leaning slightly forward. "I need to ask you again. Are you certain that this is your seat? There must be some mistake." The girl's heart sank a little, but she did not show it. She looked the attendant in the eye and spoke calmly. "Yes, I'm certain. I have my ticket and I am in the correct seat." The attendant frowned and glanced around as if searching for support. First class is very exclusive. You do realize that, don't you? Are you traveling with someone who booked this for you? The girl shook her head politely. No, I'm traveling alone. This is my seat. She tried to keep her voice steady, but inside a mix of frustration and disbelief swirled. She had never expected that simply sitting in her rightful seat would cause such resistance. Nearby, a few passengers were now paying closer attention. Some looked curious, others sympathetic. One older woman leaned toward her companion and whispered something, casting a glance at the young girl that was filled with quiet concern. The girl noticed it but kept her composure, remembering her father's advice. Patience and dignity could handle situations that anger could only worsen. The attendant stepped back slightly, crossing her arms. I cannot let this go without checking. Are you sure someone did not make a mistake at the counter? The girl's voice remained calm. I checked in myself. Everything is correct. She held her ticket up for the attendant to see, but the hesitation on the attendant's face did not fade. She looked at the ticket, then at the girl, then back at the ticket again. The moment stretched uncomfortably, the tension almost tangible. It was clear that the attendant did not believe her. The young girl felt a surge of emotions, anger, disbelief, but also a strange, calm determination. She had faced challenges before, but this was different. It was not a simple disagreement or a small misunderstanding. It was something deeper, a subtle judgment, a doubt cast not because of anything she had done, but because of how she looked, how young she was, and perhaps because of the color of her skin. The girl breathed deeply, centering herself. She had been taught to handle difficult situations without losing her composure. She smiled politely, trying to ease the tension. I really appreciate your concern, ma'am, but I am sure that everything is correct. I am allowed to be here and I am traveling in first class today. The attendant's eyes narrowed slightly. She seemed to be struggling internally, torn between following protocol and confronting her own doubts. She muttered something under her breath and stepped back, but it was not over. Instead of moving on, she called the flight supervisor over. The supervisor arrived, a middle-aged man with a calm demeanor. He smiled at the passengers as he walked through the cabin, then turned his attention to the young girl. Hello, he said politely. Is there a problem with your seat? The flight attendant spoke quickly, clearly flustered. This passenger. She says she has a first-class ticket, but I'm not sure. I just need confirmation. The supervisor looked at the girl and then at her ticket. He scanned it carefully, his expression neutral but attentive. Everything seems correct, he said finally. This is your seat. Please enjoy your flight. The girl nodded politely, thanking him quietly. But the attendant's discomfort had not disappeared. She lingered nearby, clearly unable to let the situation rest. She moved past the girl to attend other passengers, but each time she glanced back, there was a trace of disbelief in her expression. The young girl tried to focus on the flight again. She watched the clouds drift by outside the window, feeling the gentle sway of the plane as it climbed higher. She reminded herself that this was a small moment in the larger journey of her life. But even as she tried to relax, she could not ignore the undercurrent of tension. It was a reminder of how quickly assumptions could be made, how easily people could judge without knowing the full story. Minutes passed, and the flight continued smoothly. The young girl's composure never wavered. She took a deep breath and looked around. Other passengers were now chatting quietly, some casting curious glances, others simply absorbed in their own travel. She reminded herself that the attention would fade, that she could focus on her own experience rather than the doubts of those around her. Despite her efforts to stay calm, a small part of her wondered how long this subtle judgment would continue. She had handled the situation politely and firmly, yet the flight attendant's doubt seemed almost personal. The young girl realized that this was more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a reflection of a deeper issue, one that she would have to navigate with patience, intelligence, and dignity. At that moment, her phone buzzed in her bag. She pulled it out discreetly and saw a message from her father, checking in. She smiled slightly, reassured by the connection. He had always been her guide, her source of calm advice and wisdom. She typed a quick reply, letting him know she was fine, but hinting at the tension she had just experienced. The attendant, noticing the movement, glanced in her direction again. The girl held her gaze for a brief moment and then returned to her seat, focusing on the screen in front of her. She knew that eventually the situation would be resolved, But for now, she needed to remain composed and patient. As the flight continued, the girl's mind wandered to what she would do once the flight landed. She thought about the lessons she had learned already. How to remain calm in the face of doubt, how to assert her rights politely but firmly, and how to handle judgment without letting it define her. She felt a quiet strength growing inside her, a confidence that she could carry into the next moments of her life. The flight attendant moved away, attending to other passengers, but her glances returned periodically. Each time the young girl met her eyes calmly, a silent reminder that she was not intimidated. She had handled the situation with grace, and she would continue to do so. The supervisor passed by again, giving a small nod of reassurance. The young girl smiled quietly to herself. She had faced the doubt and judgment with patience and dignity, and she felt a quiet sense of triumph. It was not about winning or proving anyone wrong. It was about remaining true to herself, about handling a difficult situation with maturity and composure. As the plane leveled off and the flight became smoother, the young girl finally allowed herself to relax slightly. She leaned back in her seat, feeling the comfort and quiet of first class. She looked out the window once more, watching the clouds drift endlessly, and felt a sense of peace. Even with the earlier tension, she knew she had handled the situation well. She had maintained her composure, asserted her rights politely, and stayed true to herself. The experience had taught her an important lesson about patience, dignity, and self-confidence, a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her life. And as she settled into the rhythm of the flight, the young girl felt a quiet excitement for the journey ahead, not just the physical journey through the skies, but the journey of life filled with challenges, lessons, and opportunities to show grace and courage. The young girl sat quietly in her seat, watching the clouds float by outside the window. The plane had finally reached a comfortable altitude, and the hum of the engines created a gentle background rhythm. For a moment she let herself relax, thinking that perhaps the tension with the flight attendant had passed. But deep down, she knew that the lingering doubt and judgment had not disappeared. The subtle looks, the whispered comments, and the hesitant glances from the crew were still there. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She had been holding back, trying not to escalate the situation unnecessarily, but now she felt it was time to act. She dialed her father's number, her fingers steady, her heart calm. He answered almost immediately, his voice warm and reassuring. "Hello, sweetheart. How is your flight?" he asked. "It's okay," she replied, trying to sound casual. "But there's something I need to tell you." She took a deep breath and explained the situation with the flight attendant, the doubt about her seat, and the subtle judgment she had felt since boarding. She spoke calmly, clearly, without anger, simply stating the facts. Her father listened quietly, his tone calm but firm. "I understand," he said after a moment. "I will take care of this. You just stay in your seat and remain calm. I'll make sure the crew understands the situation immediately." The girl felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had always known that her father could handle difficult situations, and hearing his voice gave her a quiet sense of security. She ended the call knowing that things would soon be resolved. But she also knew that this was not just about authority. It was about making sure that respect and dignity were restored, not just for her, but for anyone who might face similar judgment in the future. Almost immediately, there was movement in the cabin. The flight attendant who had questioned her presence approached her once again, but this time her demeanor had changed slightly. She was still professional, but there was a hint of nervousness, a recognition that the situation was no longer entirely in her control. Before the attendant could speak, the young girl's father's assistant appeared at the cabin door. "Hello," the assistant said politely, addressing the flight attendant. "The passenger in question is traveling on a legitimate first-class ticket. Please ensure she is treated accordingly." The flight attendant's eyes widened in surprise. She nodded quickly, her previous confidence replaced with a mixture of embarrassment and realization. "Yes, of course," she said, her voice slightly strained. She turned back to the young girl, her expression apologetic but awkward. I apologize for the confusion. Please enjoy your flight." The girl nodded politely, accepting the words without resentment. She had learned early in life that dignity often came from composure, not confrontation. She returned her attention to the window, watching the world below, and felt a quiet satisfaction. The tension that had hung in the air for so long was beginning to lift. As the flight continued, the young girl reflected on what had just happened. It was more than a simple misunderstanding or mistake. It was a lesson in human behavior, in assumptions and judgments, and in the way people could react when confronted with something unexpected. She realized that the flight attendant had not acted out of malice alone. There was fear, uncertainty, and perhaps ingrained bias. Understanding this did not excuse the behavior, but it allowed the girl to process the experience with clarity and calm. Meanwhile, the flight attendant moved through the cabin more carefully. She attended to other passengers efficiently, occasionally glancing at the young girl who returned each look with quiet confidence. The shift in the attendant's demeanor was subtle but noticeable. She was no longer challenging or doubtful. There was now an awareness of authority and accountability. The supervisor also approached, speaking briefly with the flight attendant and then giving a nod in the young girl's direction. "Everything is resolved," he said softly with a hint of respect. "Please let us know if you need anything else." The girl smiled politely, acknowledging his words. She felt a mix of relief and pride. She had handled the situation calmly, and the proper resolution had been reached without confrontation. This was not about winning an argument. It was about asserting her rightful place with dignity and composure. As the plane leveled off, the young girl allowed herself to settle into the comfort of her seat. She unbuckled slightly, stretching her legs and adjusting the blanket around her. She felt a quiet sense of triumph, not because the flight attendant had been corrected, but because she had maintained her integrity and composure throughout the ordeal. A flight attendant came by with a drink cart, offering beverages and snacks. The young girl requested her choice politely, and the attendant served her with a professional smile. There was no hesitation this time, no questioning of her seat or her right to be there. It was a small but meaningful moment, a sign that respect had been restored. Nearby passengers continued to notice the subtle changes in the cabin. Some exchanged quiet smiles or nods of understanding. A few whispered compliments, acknowledging the young girl's calm and composed handling of the situation. She felt a quiet warmth, not from pride alone, but from knowing that dignity and patience could have an impact, even in a small corner of the world. As the flight progressed, the young girl's thoughts wandered to her father again. She felt gratitude for his guidance, his calm presence, and his unwavering support. He had taught her not only to handle difficult situations, but also to observe, understand, and act with integrity. That guidance had served her well today, turning a potentially embarrassing or stressful situation into a lesson in patience, confidence, and respect. She also reflected on the power of influence and accountability. The fact that her father had authority in the airline had resolved the immediate tension, but she understood that respect and dignity should not depend solely on authority or connections. They should be inherent in every interaction, in every moment of human connection. This realization gave her a quiet sense of responsibility. She wanted to use her experiences to help others, to set an example of calm strength and respectful assertion. The young girl leaned back in her seat, glancing out the window once more. The sun was now higher in the sky, casting a golden light over the clouds. She felt a sense of freedom, not just from the resolution of the conflict, but from the knowledge that she had handled herself with grace. The clouds stretched endlessly, a reminder that the world was vast and full of possibilities. Suddenly, the flight attendant approached once again, this time with a small card. "For you," she said quietly, placing it on the girl's tray table. "I apologize for earlier. This is a small gesture to show my respect and acknowledgement of the mistake." The young girl looked at the card and smiled gently. It was a simple note, but it carried a powerful message of recognition and accountability. She thanked the attendant politely, understanding that acknowledgement was sometimes the first step toward meaningful change. The flight attendant nodded, clearly relieved that the tension had eased. She returned to her duties, and for the remainder of the flight, she maintained a professional and respectful presence. The young girl felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that patience, calmness, and integrity had guided the outcome. As the plane cruised at high altitude, the young girl allowed herself to enjoy the view and the comforts of first class. She watched the sun glinting off the clouds, creating patterns that seemed almost magical. The hum of the engines was steady, the cabin now filled with a calm energy that had been missing earlier. She took a sip of her drink, savoring the moment of peace and reflection. In her mind, she reviewed the events of the day. From the initial doubt at the boarding gate, to the subtle judgment of the flight attendant, and finally, to the resolution brought about by her father's intervention, every moment had been a lesson. She had learned about human behavior, about assumptions and bias, about the importance of calmness and dignity. She had also learned that even in moments of discomfort or challenge, she could maintain her composure and assert her rights respectfully. The young girl thought about how she would carry this lesson forward. She knew that life would present many situations where patience, calmness, and integrity would be essential. She felt a quiet strength within herself, a confidence that she could face challenges with grace and intelligence. The experience on this flight was just one small chapter, but it had already left a lasting impression on her. As the hours passed, the young girl continued to watch the world from above. She reflected on the power of observation, the importance of understanding, and the impact of quiet strength. She realized that true confidence did not come from proving others wrong, but from knowing one's worth and acting with dignity, even in the face of doubt or judgment. The flight continued smoothly, and the young girl felt a sense of calm satisfaction. She had faced a challenge, navigated it with integrity, and emerged with her composure intact. The resolution had not come from confrontation but from patience, understanding, and the quiet support of her father. She knew that these were lessons she would carry with her always, in every journey and in every interaction. The sun began to set outside, casting warm, golden light across the cabin. The young girl leaned back in her seat, feeling a sense of peace and accomplishment. She had faced an uncomfortable situation with strength, dignity, and calmness, and she had learned an important lesson about human behavior, respect, and integrity. And as she watched the sky change colors, she felt a quiet excitement for the journey ahead, both in the air and in life. She knew that whatever challenges might come her way, she could face them with patience, confidence, and grace, a lesson that would stay with her long after the flight had landed. The young girl leaned back in her first-class seat, feeling the soft cushion beneath her and the gentle hum of the plane around her. The tension that had been so present earlier was slowly fading, replaced by a quiet sense of relief. The flight attendant, who had been so hesitant and doubtful at the start, moved through the cabin with professionalism and care. She no longer cast suspicious glances, and her demeanor had changed noticeably. The young girl could feel the subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere, a sense of respect settling in where there had been tension. She took a deep breath, trying to savor the moment. For a while, she simply watched the clouds outside the window, marveling at the patterns they made. The sun was shining through in streaks of golden light, casting a soft glow on everything inside the cabin. She felt a quiet happiness. It wasn't just about being in first class. It was about the calm and dignity she had maintained despite the earlier discomfort. As she relaxed, the flight attendant approached her once more, this time with a polite smile and a small tray. "Here is a drink for you," she said gently, placing a glass in front of the young girl. "I hope you enjoy it. Again, I apologize for earlier." The girl smiled politely. "Thank you," she said softly. She understood that apologies, even if small, were important. They signaled acknowledgement and a willingness to correct mistakes. She appreciated the gesture, knowing it reflected a shift in understanding. Other passengers in the first-class section were now paying attention as well. Some looked curious, others whispered quietly, and a few offered small smiles. It was clear that the tension from earlier had not gone unnoticed. The young girl could feel their awareness, their recognition of what had happened. It was not about showing off or making a scene. It was about the quiet assertion of dignity and fairness, something that did not go unnoticed by those around her. The plane continued its smooth flight, and the young girl finally allowed herself to settle in fully. She adjusted her seat, arranged her belongings neatly, and let herself enjoy the little comforts first class offered: the extra legroom, the soft blanket, and the ability to simply watch the world from above. She reflected on the lessons of the morning and the way the situation had unfolded. It had been more than just a dispute over a seat. It had been a lesson in human behavior, assumptions, and the power of composure. She realized that people often acted out of fear or uncertainty, and that misjudgments could happen even when no harm was intended. Understanding this did not excuse the behavior, but it allowed her to respond with calmness and grace. She understood the importance of patience and the quiet strength that came from maintaining dignity. even when others questioned it. Meanwhile, the flight attendant continued her duties with a careful professionalism. She served passengers, checked their needs, and ensured everything ran smoothly. Yet there was a noticeable difference in how she interacted with the young girl. Her earlier doubt and hesitation had been replaced with a polite attentiveness. She acknowledged the girl's presence without judgment, a small but meaningful shift that reflected respect and recognition. The young girl took a small notebook from her bag and began to write quietly. She noted the lessons she had learned from the experience, the importance of patience, the strength that came from calmness, and the way dignity could influence outcomes. She wrote about human behavior, about assumptions and the subtle ways people could judge one another, and about how to navigate such situations without anger or confrontation. Writing helped her process everything that had happened, turning it into a clear understanding she could carry forward. A few passengers nearby glanced at her notebook, curious about what she was writing. She smiled politely at them but returned to her thoughts. She knew that her reflections were personal, a private way to process the day's events. But even so, she felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her composure had set an example, however small, for those around her. As the flight continued, the young girl's phone buzzed again. She checked it discreetly and saw a message from her father. He asked how she was doing and whether the situation had been resolved. She smiled, typing back a brief reply that everything was fine and that she was handling herself well. She felt gratitude for his guidance and calm presence, which had helped her navigate the situation with dignity. The plane reached cruising altitude, and the view outside was breathtaking. The young girl watched the clouds stretch endlessly beneath the golden sun, the landscape below barely visible. She thought about the lessons she had learned and how they would stay with her long after the flight ended. Life, she realized, was full of moments that tested patience and composure. And it was in those moments that true strength and character were revealed. Minutes passed, and the young girl noticed a subtle shift in the cabin atmosphere. The flight attendant, who had been attentive, approached the supervisor and whispered something briefly. The supervisor then gave a small nod, a silent acknowledgement that the situation had been handled appropriately. The young girl felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. The proper resolution had not come from anger or confrontation, but from patience, composure, and understanding. Soon after, the flight attendant approached once more, this time carrying a small card. She placed it gently on the young girl's tray table. "This is for you," she said softly. "I wanted to acknowledge the earlier misunderstanding. I hope you accept it." The girl picked up the card and smiled gently. It was a simple gesture, but it carried meaning. It represented recognition, accountability, and a willingness to correct a mistake. She thanked the flight attendant politely, feeling a sense of closure. The moment symbolized more than an apology. It was a reflection of growth, awareness, and respect. Other passengers nearby noticed the exchange. Some nodded approvingly. Others whispered quietly to each other, acknowledging what had happened. The young girl felt a quiet warmth, knowing that the lessons of patience, composure, and dignity had ripple effects beyond her alone. Her calm strength had influenced the people around her, demonstrating that handling challenges gracefully could make a difference. As the flight continued, the young girl leaned back and allowed herself to fully enjoy the journey. She sipped her drink, watched the clouds pass by, and reflected on the day's events. She understood that life often presented situations where judgment, assumptions, and subtle biases could create tension. But she also knew that how one responded, calmly, patiently, and with dignity, could transform the outcome. She thought about the flight attendant and the supervisor. Neither had intended to be unkind, but the situation had highlighted assumptions and doubts that needed correction. The resolution, achieved without anger or confrontation, showed the power of composure and quiet strength. It was a lesson in empathy as well, understanding that people could make mistakes, and that correction and accountability were possible when approached with patience. Hours passed, and the young girl continued to observe the world from above. The sun began to lower toward the horizon, casting golden and orange hues across the clouds. The cabin was calm, and the atmosphere had shifted completely from the earlier tension. She felt a quiet satisfaction, knowing that she had maintained her integrity and composure throughout the ordeal. She thought about how this experience would shape her in the future. Life would present many challenges, judgments, doubts, misunderstandings, and moments of tension, but she now had the confidence to navigate them with grace. The lessons she had learned were not about winning or proving others wrong. They were about maintaining dignity, responding with patience, and asserting her rights respectfully. The flight attendant passed by one last time before the meal service. She nodded politely at the young girl, a silent acknowledgement of the earlier tension and its resolution. The young girl smiled slightly, returning the gesture with quiet confidence. There was no need for words. The exchange spoke volumes about respect, awareness, and personal strength. The young girl leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes for a moment, reflecting on the journey so far. From the initial boarding tension to the resolution and the acknowledgement of respect, the day had been a series of lessons. She realized that patience and dignity were powerful tools, capable of transforming uncomfortable situations into opportunities for growth and understanding. She opened her eyes again, watching the golden sunlight illuminate the clouds outside. The sense of calm and accomplishment stayed with her, a quiet reminder that strength often came from composure, patience, and integrity. She understood that life's challenges could be met with grace, and that the impact of such behavior extended beyond the individual to those around them. The young girl took a deep breath, savoring the quiet moment. She felt a renewed sense of confidence and calm, knowing that she had handled the situation with grace and dignity. The flight continued smoothly, and the young girl allowed herself to fully enjoy the experience, reflecting on the lessons learned and the quiet strength she had discovered within herself. She thought about the future and the challenges she might face. She knew that life would continue to present moments that tested patience, integrity, and composure, but she also knew that she now had the tools to handle them with grace, to assert her rights respectfully, and to maintain her dignity in every situation. As the plane flew steadily through the sky, the young girl leaned back in her seat, feeling a quiet peace and satisfaction. The earlier tension was behind her, replaced by calmness, understanding, and a sense of accomplishment. She knew that the lessons of the day would stay with her, guiding her in every journey, every interaction, and every challenge that lay ahead. And as the sun dipped lower toward the horizon, casting warm golden light across the cabin, the young girl felt a quiet joy. She had faced a challenge, navigated it with patience and composure, and emerged stronger and wiser. It was more than a flight, it was a lesson in dignity, respect, and quiet strength, one she would carry with her long after the plane had landed. The young girl leaned back in her seat, feeling the steady hum of the plane beneath her. The earlier tension had completely faded, replaced by a quiet sense of calm and reflection. She had faced an uncomfortable situation with composure, and now the cabin seemed to hum with normalcy. Passengers chatted softly, some glanced out the window at the clouds, and the flight attendants moved through the cabin with a calm professionalism. She thought about the events of the day, the initial doubt at the boarding gate, the hesitant glances, and the subtle judgment from the flight attendant. At first, the experience had made her feel frustrated and uncertain. She had wondered why simply sitting in her rightful seat had caused so much doubt. But now, after seeing the situation resolved, she understood that it had been more than a simple misunderstanding. It was a lesson in patience, dignity, and the quiet strength needed to handle challenges with grace. The young girl watched the clouds drift by outside her window. Feeling the soft vibration of the plane beneath her, she remembered how her father had guided her through the situation. His calm voice over the phone had given her reassurance, reminding her to stay composed and to handle the problem respectfully. She realized that his guidance had been about more than just authority. It had been about teaching her to navigate the world with integrity and confidence, even when faced with doubt or judgment. As the flight continued, the young girl reflected on the power of composure. She had chosen not to react with anger or frustration, and the outcome had been far better than she could have imagined. The flight attendant had apologized, acknowledged the mistake, and treated her with respect. Passengers had noticed, and even in subtle ways, her calm strength had influenced the atmosphere around her. She understood that dignity and patience were not just personal virtues. They could change the way others behaved and how situations unfolded. She looked around the cabin, observing the interactions of people. Some passengers were reading quietly, others were chatting with companions, and a few glanced curiously at the young girl, perhaps noticing the calm confidence she exuded. She realized that her behavior had been noticed in ways she hadn't imagined. It was a quiet demonstration of strength, one that did not require confrontation or argument, but simply the steady assertion of one's rights with grace and respect. Her thoughts returned to the flight attendant. She knew that the crew had not acted out of malice. Their hesitation and doubt had come from uncertainty and ingrained assumptions. The young girl understood that people sometimes make mistakes when faced with situations that challenge their expectations. By handling herself calmly, she had allowed the attendant to correct the mistake without embarrassment or conflict. It was a lesson in empathy as well as dignity, understanding others even when they falter, and responding with patience and composure. The flight continued smoothly, and the young girl took a moment to enjoy the comforts of first class. She adjusted her seat, stretched her legs, and allowed herself to take in the view outside. The clouds stretched endlessly beneath the plane, painted with soft colors from the sun as it began its slow descent toward the horizon. She felt a quiet sense of peace, a feeling that came not just from comfort but from having faced a challenge and handled it well. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a message from her father. He asked if she was enjoying the flight and reminded her to stay safe and calm until they landed. She smiled as she typed a reply, expressing her gratitude for his guidance and support. His calm presence had been her anchor during the tension, and she knew she had learned lessons that would stay with her for a long time. As she set her phone aside, she reflected on how much she had grown from the experience. She realized that life was full of unexpected challenges, moments when people might judge, doubt, or question her for reasons beyond her control. But she also knew that her response, to remain calm, patient, and composed, was a choice she could always make. That choice gave her power, dignity, and confidence. It was a lesson that went far beyond this flight, something she would carry into every aspect of her life. The flight attendants moved through the cabin one last time before the meal service, offering snacks and drinks. The young girl accepted politely, engaging in small, courteous conversation when appropriate. The attendant who had caused the initial tension smiled at her and offered a polite apology once more. The young girl acknowledged it with a calm nod, feeling a quiet satisfaction. The acknowledgement was meaningful, not just as an apology, but as recognition of respect and accountability. Nearby passengers watched quietly, some exchanging knowing glances. The young girl understood that they had noticed the earlier tension and the way she had handled it. She felt a subtle warmth, knowing that her composure had left an impression. It was a reminder that the way one responds to challenges can influence not only the immediate situation, but also the people around them. As the flight continued, the young girl began to reflect on the broader lessons of the day. She realized that patience and composure were tools of strength, allowing her to navigate difficult situations without unnecessary conflict. She understood that dignity was not dependent on others' behavior. It came from within, from the steady confidence in one's own worth and abilities. And she knew that empathy, understanding, and recognition of others' mistakes were equally important, allowing for resolution and growth without anger or resentment. The sun outside began to lower further, casting golden and pink hues across the clouds. The young girl felt a quiet contentment, savoring the beauty of the view and the calm of the moment. She thought about how life would continue to present challenges, but she felt ready to face them. The experience on this flight had strengthened her, teaching lessons that would guide her in every interaction, every decision, and every moment where patience and dignity were needed. She considered the people she had encountered, the flight attendant, the supervisor, and even the passengers who had noticed the tension. Each had played a role in the experience, consciously or unconsciously. She realized that interactions, even small ones, had the potential to teach lessons about respect, understanding, and human behavior. Her calm response had influenced the outcome, showing that quiet strength could be more powerful than confrontation or argument. Hours passed, and the young girl continued to reflect on the day's events. She felt gratitude for her father's guidance, for the lessons he had taught her, and for the way he had provided support and wisdom when she needed it most. She realized that true strength often came from preparation, guidance, and inner confidence, allowing one to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. The plane began its slow descent toward the destination. The young girl adjusted her seatbelt and gazed out the window at the shrinking landscape below. She felt a quiet anticipation for landing, but also a sense of satisfaction in knowing that she had handled the situation with grace from start to finish. The lesson of dignity and composure was one she would carry with her far beyond this flight. As the flight attendants prepared the cabin for landing, the young girl allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought about the impact of her actions not in terms of proving others wrong, but in asserting her rights calmly and respectfully. She had faced judgment, doubt, and subtle bias, yet she had emerged with confidence and dignity intact. This was a lesson that would remain with her for a lifetime. The plane touched down smoothly, and the young girl gathered her belongings with quiet efficiency. She noticed the flight attendant giving her a small, respectful nod, and she returned the gesture with a calm smile. The acknowledgement was meaningful, a sign that respect and understanding had been restored fully. As she walked down the aisle, the young girl reflected on the journey. From the first moments of doubt and judgment at the boarding gate to the resolution and acknowledgement she had learned about patience, integrity, and quiet strength. She understood that life would continue to present challenges, but she now had confidence in her ability to navigate them with grace. Exiting the plane, she felt a renewed sense of empowerment. The experience had not been easy, but it had taught her lessons she would never forget. Patience, dignity, composure, and empathy were powerful tools, allowing her to face challenges calmly and assertively. She realized that these lessons were not only for herself, they were examples that could influence others, shaping the way people interacted and responded in moments of tension. As she walked through the airport, she noticed people moving around her, some smiling politely, others focused on their own tasks. She felt a quiet sense of pride, not in showing authority or power, but in the strength and composure she had demonstrated. The experience had been transformative, reinforcing her understanding of respect, patience, and dignity in the face of judgment and challenge. The young girl thought about the future. She knew that life would continue to present situations where assumptions, doubt, and subtle bias could occur, but she also knew that she now had the confidence, patience, and composure to handle them. The lessons she had learned on this flight would guide her in school, in her social life, and in any situation where integrity and dignity were tested. She paused for a moment near the baggage claim, reflecting on the journey as a whole. The day had started with excitement, followed by tension and discomfort, and ended with calm, understanding, and growth. She realized that the most important part of the experience had been how she responded, with patience, grace, and quiet strength. It was a lesson she would carry with her always. As she collected her luggage and walked toward the exit, the young girl felt a quiet sense of satisfaction and empowerment. The flight had been more than a journey through the sky. It had been a journey of personal growth, teaching her about patience, dignity, empathy, and the strength that comes from handling challenges calmly. And as she stepped out into the sunlight of the airport terminal, she knew that the lessons of the day would stay with her. She had faced judgment and doubt, responded with grace and composure, and emerged stronger and wiser. The experience had left her with a deep understanding of respect, integrity, and the quiet power of patience, a lesson she would carry with her in every moment of her life.